Greetings, fellow lovers of the Bible, as we meet to consider the sixth great O antiphon of Advent, which begins with the words, O King of Nations. O Rex Gentium. King of the Nations is a phrase introduced by the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 10 of his book. This was a novelty, a new expression that seemingly did not exist up until that point. Why is it that as the kingdom of Israel was entering into the final stages of collapse on earth, as Jeremiah saw the kingdom fall, that the phrase King of the Nations came to be attributed to the God of Israel? Well, I think part of the key to the answer can be found earlier in the book of Jeremiah. In fact, at the very beginning, in verse 5 of chapter 1, when the Lord calls Jeremiah to become a prophet not to Israel, but a prophet to the nations. Navi Lagoyim, a prophet to the nations, to the Goyim, to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish nations. Jeremiah began his life in Anatot, a village near Jerusalem, but he ended his life in exile in Egypt. Who had the authority to appoint a prophet? The king did. But now there will be no king. So which king will anoint Jeremiah as the prophet to the nations? God himself will be that king. God has sovereignty over the nations, and therefore God has the authority to appoint a prophet to the nations. So you see how the two titles complement each other. If Jeremiah is going to be the prophet to the nations, then he has to represent a God who is king over the nations. Only such a God would have the authority to appoint such a prophet. There were many prophets in all the nations, and every nation had a king, but most nations worshipped only its own local god, which had no claims on universal sovereignty. As the kingdom of Israel shrank to a vanishing point, the notion of the God of Israel expanded to become a universal God instead of just a local one. Only if there is a universal God can the universal desire of all nations for peace, tranquility, and good governance be satisfied. Unless there is security for all, there is no security for any, and therefore no nation can take refuge in a xenophobic God, but only all nations taking refuge in a universal God. Et desideratus earum. The yearnings of Israel were not unique. Every nation has the same hopes and dreams, and the church identifies with the hopes and dreams of all the nations. What was unique to Israel was that they had received the promises. And what is unique about the church is that in the church the promises have been fulfilled. Because a cornerstone has been laid to bring together all the hopes and bind together all the nations under the sovereignty of God. Lapisque angularis, qui faces utraque unum. Who is this cornerstone that binds all things together? It is Jesus himself, the one who is coming. Veni, et salva hominem, quem de limo formasti. Chapter 2 of Genesis describes God as shaping humanity from clay. There is actually much wisdom to this because the human body is composed of earth minerals. The human bloodstream has the components of the primitive ocean. We are creatures of earth, which is why Genesis calls us earth beings, Adam. Yes, God created Adam, the first man, and all of humanity to be of earth and from earth. And therefore, he is sovereign of earth and of all of us who are upon the earth. The rightful sovereign is the Creator himself. The one we are waiting for is the one who is going to take this humanity shaped from clay and graft it onto himself, so that the humanity that God created will be united with and coexisting with the divinity that created it. These 7 O antiphons were 7 lights burning brightly during the Dark Ages, ignited during the period of nearly total collapse of the Empire of Rome. Just as the phrase King of the Nations grew out of the collapse of the Kingdom of Israel, the creation of this O antiphon came during the time of the collapse of the Western Empire. The Byzantine Empire was still thriving in the East, but in the West there was no government at all. What they called kings during the 700s, 600s, 500s in the western half of the Roman Empire had less jurisdiction than the governors did during imperial Rome. St. Ambrose, as governor of Milan, had more power and authority than Odoacer or Theodoric or the Gothic kings of Italy. What had been one empire for the whole Mediterranean area became subdivided into tiny bandit kingdoms without the tradition and institutions of governance, without a civil service. And so the church often had to step in and help people because government had disappeared. And since there were only minor kings in the West now, and no emperor, who could fill the gap at the top of the pyramid of the hierarchy? Only God himself could fill it. So the phrase King of the Nations, applied to God, became a substitute for the imperial majesty. God stepped in where the emperor had been, and the church stepped in where the civil service had been, and had to keep things going for several hundred years between the fall of Rome and the rise of Charlemagne. Our antiphon comes out of this period. There is no emperor of the world today. There are many nation states combined in various groupings such as the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, and so forth. But no one person occupies a position at the head of the human race today. Again, as in the Dark Ages, there's a gap at the top of the pyramid, one that can only be filled in our time by Christ the King, who is celebrated on the last Sunday of the church year at the end of November. O Rex Gentium et desideratus earum, lapisque angularis, qui faces utraque unum. Veni et salva hominem, quem de limo formasti.